Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. We will let everybody get settled for a moment, and then we will get started. I'm Alan Goodwin. I'm with the UDO team from the Charlotte Planning Department, and I'm joined here by my UDO team colleagues, Laura Harmon and Kevin May. I also see Douglas Welton, the chair of our Planning Commission, joining us tonight, and a few other familiar faces. We still have some people joining, so we will hang on for just a minute before we start our presentation. And if you signed in using a phone number, would you change that to your name? Would you rename yourself if you know how to do that in Zoom so that we know who you are? I see a phone number ending in 4231. So if you're able to rename yourself, we'd appreciate that. All right, I am going to share my screen with you, and we will get started with our presentation. All right. Good. Okay, thank you. We're here tonight to provide some information on a UDO text amendment. It's number 2024-033. It's a general UDO update. So the way that this meeting will work is that we have several slides that we'll present with information on this text amendment. If you have questions or comments, please use the chat feature in Zoom. I don't know that we'll be able to keep up with all of the questions in live time, but at the end of the presentation, we will go back and answer whatever questions we do get through chat. This presentation, this meeting is only focused on the contents of the UDO General Update Text Amendment. If you have comments or questions about the UDO or other elements of the UDO not related to this text amendment, we'd appreciate it and welcome it if you would send us an email with those comments or questions to the email address on the screen, charlotteudo@charlottenc.gov. A little background on the UDO. It is the primary implementation tool to implement the adopted policies of the Charlotte Future 2040 Comprehensive Plan. The UDO was adopted by City Council in August of 2022. It went into effect on June 1st of last year. So we have been using it for almost a year now. It is and has been intended to be a living document, meaning that it can change over time through text amendments so that it maintains relevancy. We can clarify things that are not clear in the UDO. We can incorporate new concepts and uses and best practices. And let me just, if you're not familiar with reading a text amendment, this slide I'll walk you through this. At the end, we will let you know where you can go online to our website, where to find this text amendment, as well as other text amendments to the UDO. But when you do look at the actual text amendment, the portions that are being removed or changed will be shown in red with a strike through, like the example in the upper right. Any new material in the text amendment, or rather in the UDO, introduced through this text amendment will be shown in red underlined. And then it is possible that we will have made changes to the text amendment between the first time we filed it and a subsequent filing. And if there are changes like that, they will be shown highlighted in yellow. And in fact, we have done that for this particular text amendment. So we have made changes after the first filing. So when you do go in to look at it, you will see certain things that are highlighted in yellow. Those are just subsequent changes to the first text amendment that was filed. So a little background. We initially filed this text amendment on March 5th. We filed an updated version with changes highlighted in yellow on April 19th. This text amendment is intended to address a multitude of items that have been identified by stakeholders from the community, the design and development industry, as well as our other city and county staff. We held a similar community engagement meeting at noon today. This one will go over the same material that we shared at the noon meeting. There will be a public hearing on this text amendment at the May 20th City Council meeting. Generally, what this text amendment covers, and we'll go into greater detail in the next several slides, but this is just a high-level update, a high-level overview, I should say. We are updating several elements of the UDO for greater clarity, including definitions. We are clarifying existing uses and use permissions and prescribed conditions, and also introducing some new uses. We're revising dimensional and design standards for several of the zoning districts in the UDO. We're making adjustments to landscaping, tree planting, and preservation standards, and also recreating an alternative compliance review committee. And we'll go into that at the end of the presentation. So I believe at this time, we'll take a deeper dive into what these actual changes are. And I will turn it over to Kevin May. Kevin.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you for all of our guests here this evening for this session. As Alan touched on, and Alan, can I have the next slide, please? As Alan touched on, this is a really rather exhaustive text amendment that has been proposed. And we as staff are going to do the very best that we can this evening to convey some of the highlights of that text amendment. That being said, it's completely understandable that some of the stuff that we're going to go over in the coming slides may in of itself be somewhat weedy or somewhat complicated. So we encourage you, if you've got questions, to please follow up and reach out to us with any questions that you may have. We also did send a message out yesterday, so hopefully you had an opportunity perhaps to review the text amendment prior to your attendance here this evening, and you've maybe identified some topics that may be interested to you that you'd like to ask about or discuss. So I'd like to kick us off about talking about just a little bit more of the general changes that affect the UDO in its entirety. And some of the proposals include clarifying applicability of the UDO to conditional zoning districts. As Alan said previously, we've made some adjustments and modifications to the general terms in the definitions article of the UDO. We're offering specifications for structures and whether they're attached or detached when there are multiple structures on a lot. We've got several sections of the UDO that touch on parking lot maintenance and repair, and because of that and some pain points that we were having with that, we've offered some clarity regarding what is considered parking lot maintenance and repair. And then we further clarified that certain resultant parcels put together through combinations or recombinations, but which may be exempt from normal subdivision regulations, that those resultant parcels still must comply with all the other applicable standards of the UDO. Switching now and talking briefly about some design and dimensional standards that have been proposed in the change. We have established a new block face criteria for sidewall measurements for duplex and triplex buildings in the neighborhood 1 zoning districts and for all structures in the residential infill overlay zoning district. We've added a Class B landscape yard option for multifamily attached residential developments. We have created some flexibility with regard to build-to-zone requirements when certain site conflicts or constraints exist. We have further clarified the measuring point for maximum building height transitions, and we've clarified the maximum spacing standards for required prominent entrances. Following up with yet some more design and dimensional standards that are being proposed, adjustments being proposed, we've offered flexibility in the calculation of minimum building length as a percentage of a lot. We have modified it or eliminated selected standards for triplex and quadruplex buildings. And just to dive into this one specifically a little bit more, for those of you that are on our call and may be familiar with the recent changes to state law that have changed how triplexes and quadruplexes are treated with regard to the North Carolina Residential Code. It was really that change in state legislation that necessitated that we go back, examine some of the standards that we had with regard to triplex and quadruplex buildings and make some adjustments. And that's what we've done, is put forth some adjustments to comply with that updated state law. Additionally, we clarified certain standards, such as primary entry orientation and sidewall orientation and prominent entrance requirements for selected forms of residential development. And touching more on prominent entrances, we've found it necessary to specify the minimum number of those for non-residential and mixed-use development. Touching briefly now on open space, we've got 3 changes that have kind of been reflected in the current proposed text amendment. Specifically, we've offered clarity for when open space is expressly required for new construction or expansion. We're specifying when open space is required for multi-phase development. And then lastly, adding some additional clarity with regard to any multi-dwelling development also has to have some open space required as part of that development. Article 15 covers the uses in the UDO. It's a really rather beefy article of the UDO. We've got several changes proposed in that article. I believe we have 2 slides to cover the high level of those proposed changes. The first of which is the introduction of a handful of new uses in the UDO. We have taken an existing use in the current UDO, gas station, and we are renaming it vehicle fueling facility to recognize that as advances in vehicular technology continue, that gas may not be the only means by which a vehicle is fueled. We've added permissions for duplex, triplex, and quadruplex buildings as components of multi-dwelling developments in certain zoning districts. And because we have created some new uses, some of which required prescribed conditions, and also identifying adjustments to existing prescribed conditions, we have both created and modified some prescribed conditions for uses in the UDO. Another significant change is currently there's a conditional zoning requirement for what is currently termed gas station, but what is proposed to be vehicle fueling facility, as well as major and minor vehicle repair facilities. All of those currently have a conditional zoning requirement. We are proposing that that conditional zoning requirement fall away. We have adjusted, touching a little bit on the prescribed conditions topic I just spoke of. We're adjusting prescribed conditions for farms based on the size of the farm. Overall, through the article, we're making adjustments to use definitions as well as permissions in the use matrix. And as I said, prescribed conditions are being modified for certain uses. In the preface of the use article, we wanted to specify, even though a lot of us may feel like it may be unnecessary, but we found it to be so, that we specify all uses and structures shall be located on the parcels for which that structure or use has been approved. And lastly, we've created a permission for manufactured homes or single-family dwellings to be located on individual lots in a manufactured home park zoning district. Switching now briefly to accessory structures, we've got some cleanup in that article as well. One of those is some clarity with regard to locational standards for accessory structures, an example of which you can see here on the 3rd bullet, which is offering further clarity, establishing that detached carports and garages may be located in an established corner side setback. We've also introduced a new category of accessory structure, solar panels, as well as some standards with regard to the use of solar panels as an accessory structure. One of the changes in accessory structures is regarding accessory dwelling units. Currently, the UDO counts the cumulative square footage of an accessory dwelling unit against the total that may be allowed on a residential lot. We are proposing to exclude the square footage of an accessory dwelling unit from that cumulative square foot total. So to better allow property owners to have more flexibility with having an ADU and perhaps other accessory structures they may like to have, such as a garage or a shed, as an example. And then lastly, we're providing a landscape screening alternative for ground and wall mounted mechanical equipment. With that, I think now I'll pivot and hand the slides off to our studio project manager, Laura Harmon. Laura?
Thank you, Kevin. I'm going to cover a few more slides of changes, and then we will get into questions. So with respect to parking, our CG, General Commercial, and CR, which is Regional Commercial Zoning Districts, we are changing the tier for those to better recognize that these really are some of our areas, more limited areas that are more auto-oriented, and moving those from the tier 2 to tier 1 parking standards, and obviously removing them from tier 2. We are also for the tier 3 of parking standards that does reference a 400-foot distance. We're talking about walking distance with respect to when that distance triggers parking. It's a 400-foot walking distance. For senior living developments in tier 2 and tier 3, we are eliminating the parking maximums for those. We have created parking structure design requirements for these parking structures located in our neighborhood 1 zoning districts or neighborhood 2A and B zoning districts. While it's unlikely that we'll have parking structures in those districts, it is possible, particularly for institutional uses. So we thought it was important to add design requirements. And then finally, for parking, we are clarifying, the percentage of bonus EV parking spaces, EV being electronic vehicle parking spaces, which may be designed for compact vehicles. Not all of them can be designed for compact vehicles. We also have a larger update for driveways based on feedback and challenges that folks are having with driveway standards for duplexes, triplexes, and quadruplexes. And I'd say this has been a bit of a challenge in both directions. We are eliminating the maximum 24-foot cumulative width and only using a maximum 40-foot cumulative lot width to determine how much of your lot width, your lot area in front of your structure can be parking driveways and so forth. So right now, if you had a 40-foot wide lot, you could only have 16 feet of your 16 feet of width for parking. Actually, and let me go to 50-foot wide. Let me go to a 50-foot wide lot. You would only be able to have 40% at 60 feet. You would be at 24 feet, and you could never get above 24 feet. So we're eliminating that. If you have a really wide lot, you should be able to have greater flexibility. We are also going to recommend an increase from 40% to 50%, just to provide a little bit more flexibility, but to still retain a large area in front of homes for trees, lawns, and so forth. We're also adding a maximum driveway width of 12 feet between the curb and 5 foot behind the sidewalk. That's because we want to minimize the conflict between the pedestrians on the sidewalk and the people using the driveways. So as you're walking down the street, you really have as much sidewalk between lawn as possible. For lots on arterials or thoroughfares, we're adding an option for half circle or horseshoe driveway, they're sometimes called, so that people do not have to back onto an arterial. And we will be looking at an additional alternative adding after the hearing for individual driveways to have backup spaces on arterials. Again, we don't want people backing out into busy streets. And then for units without front-facing garages, we're adding a requirement that driveways cannot be in front of the structure. They need to be to the side or the rear of the building. With respect to landscaping, we are clarifying and updating the procedure for the zoning administrator to modify landscape yard. Maybe you might also think of those as previously called buffer requirements. There's a process to allow those to be modified in some cases. We're clarifying that process and making sure that it provides notification to neighboring properties. We are providing a fence or wall option for parking lot screening. And you can see in the photograph on the right that a wall is used for screening instead of what many times is used, which is shrubbery. So that is another option of the way that people can screen parking lots. We're clarifying some of the landscape yard applicability. What is the condition? What type of development? How much development require? It has to occur to have landscape yards apply. And then finally, with respect to landscaping, we're providing an option for vinyl fencing when fencing is installed as part of a landscape yard. If part of that landscape yard or buffer requires a fence, a vinyl fence will now be an option. Tree preservation and planting, one issue that has come up is that if someone has a developed site or a partially developed site, and they are, say, doing a small addition to that site, instead of having to immediately meet all of your green area, also typically tree save, or your tree planting, parking lot trees or street trees, we're making the requirement proportional to the amount of work that you're doing on a site. So if you're impacting 25% of a site, then you have to bring 25% of the site into compliance instead of 100% of the site. And so that's been a change we've been working on for a while. We want people to eventually, as they make changes over time, to come into full compliance, but from a proportionality perspective, thought that we needed to rework that. We've clarified applicability of green area, or again, typically what you're, in most cases, will be tree save area requirements and other tree planting requirements, that those do apply as part of minor subdivisions. And finally, we have a requirement in the ordinance that says that tree save has to be contiguous, and that has just turned out not to always be feasible. We want as much of that to be contiguous as possible, but we do provide some additional flexibility with the approval of the chief urban forester in accordance with the tree canopy manual. So again, a little bit more flexibility, but still continuing to get as much contiguous area as possible. Couple of minor, more administrative changes with stormwater, clarifying the applicability of surface water improvement and management, also known as swim buffers, and adjusting the period of time for a petitioner to appeal a disapproval or modification of a erosion and sedimentation control plan upheld by the UDO Board of Adjustment. So reducing that from 30 days to 15 days. So if you have a plan, it is not approved, it goes to the UDO Board of Adjustment and they agree with the administrator not approving that, then the person would have, developing the site would have 15 days in the future. And this is consistent with the approach that the state has recommended we take. Just a few things on transportation we want to point out. We have in the ordinance some requirements with respect to placement and location of driveways that seemed not to work very well for smaller lots that you would find single family homes, duplexes, triplexes, quadruplexes on. And so there is the ability for CDOT to make adjustments to the separation from that intersection to the driveway. And that was not included very clearly previously. We have also are adding a procedure to address conflicts between street cross sections found on the streets map and North Carolina Department of Transportation standards when they conflict. So in some cases, the city may be saying one thing, NCDOT may be requesting other elements of the street. There is now a process to deal with those, approach to deal with those. And then finally, we are clarifying the modification process for relocation of curb and gutter when the relocation conflicts has major conflicts with utility constraints. So in some cases, there may be a requirement in the UDO to relocate curb and gutter to move it back, but there may be significant utility facility lines in the way, making that not feasible for certain projects. So there is a process for dealing with that as well. And finally, we are establishing an alternative compliance process in the UDO. Some of you all may have been familiar with that in our TOD or transit-oriented development districts that we had in 2018, 2019, and that board was able to allow people to meet alternative standards. So the intent of this is to encourage the use of alternative and innovative design practices if they don't significantly impact surrounding development and they implement the intent of the district. And there are criteria that are provided for each item that someone could apply for. Doesn't mean that you don't have to meet a requirement. You have to meet the intent of a requirement at least the level it is in the UDO, but there is an opportunity to look at things a little bit differently. It applies to our more urban districts, not to all of our zoning districts, but the more urban districts. And this goes through by state law a quasi-judicial board, which is more of a courtroom setting or quasi-courtroom setting that has to look at the criteria, have findings of fact and conclusion of law to say, yes, this does meet the criteria. It's not a simple process of liking something better one way or another. You have to actually meet the criteria for each of the elements that you could, that could be considered under alternative compliance. So bringing that back in a quasi-judicial form, a little bit different than the way it was in TOD, but it would allow a little bit more design flexibility if you can meet a standard in a different manner, do something a little bit different, but still meet the intent of that standard. A little bit about process. We are currently obviously at May 7th. This is the second meeting we've had today. This text amendment is scheduled to go to public hearing on the 20th. We will be making probably we know some adjustments. After that, we are not able to legally make adjustments and put them out there before that. But after that, we'll be making some adjustments. Then on June 4th, this will be going to the zoning committee of the planning commission for a recommendation, and then coming back to city council on June the 17th. And I have not been into chat to see where we are with that. But I think maybe before we move into explaining, well, this is really from the beginning. So let me just explain again. You can go to our website, look for UDO amendments across the top, and then you can come and find out about the amendments, see where they've changed and so forth. And I think now we should move into if we have any questions. And I'm not seeing any.
Yeah, Laura,
Yes.
Laura, excuse me, I'll go ahead and piggyback. Yeah, there is nothing currently in the chat, but I'm going to vamp here short for a minute and say, to piggyback on what you were talking about and locating resources, I just wanted to point out, and I'm hoping everybody caught that I have placed, for the benefit of our guests tonight, some resources in chat with multiple email addresses and links, including where the UDO may be read, the UDO amendment page, specific link to the petition page for this text amendment, as well as some community area planning links and email addresses, because quite often we find that our guests can benefit from that information as well. And with that, I do see that John Friday has his hand up, so I'd welcome him to come off mute and let's hear what he has to say.
Great, Kevin. Thanks. I have two questions, one short, one long. Why are we eliminating the tier 2 and 3 parking maximums for senior living? What is the rationale?
We actually found them to be more burdensome than for multifamily.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, as we looked at them. So we really thought, we're not real worried about over parking in senior facilities.
Okay.
But there is some need sometimes to have people who are serving, that are, maybe you have nurses or you have caregivers and so forth, family members, and looking at parking a little bit differently.
Huh. Hadn't thought about that. See, it's good that you get feedback from all kinds of people.
That's right.
Okay. The second one has to do with the change in the building height transition, which is probably of no surprise to you. I understand what it says. If I understand it correctly, you measure from the residential structure closest to you, and 200 feet is then guided by this paragraph. But what if you buy a property behind 4 or 5 houses, and each of those in a different location on the property, and one has an accessory dwelling unit up against the back property? That's the closest residential structure. I think measuring from a structure is a whole new way to do this. We didn't do it in Todd. We didn't do it in PED. Child development centers are measured 400 feet from the property line of the next child development center. I don't see us getting away from a property line as being the definitive.
What we found is, as we spoke with zoning administration, and there had been some lack of clarity, that is the guidance they had been giving people, was to measure from structures. Before there was clarity.
Makes no sense. I think it makes it very difficult and very fluid. And if you are designing a project, if there are developers on here, if you bought property and you don't know that the person next to you is about to build a house and will have it finished before you get into permitting, you get to move your building, because the closest residential structure will be closer than you thought it was going to be.
If you've gotten it permitted, and one, I think we probably need to say principal structure and not be counting.
Well, see, now you're getting into all the
nuances,
and we have never done this before in the ordinance. Now, I don't know what people have done but in the ordinance, everything says to property lines. When we did the entertainment, EDDE, whatever that was called, it was to a property line. When we did, things came before the zoning committee, and I remember it was to the property line. I just think this makes it really difficult for the community to know what's going to get built next to them. And I really do think it makes the development more difficult because it's unknown.
Well, and if there is a vacant lot, you would have to measure from the property line because that's your worst case condition.
I understand, but
So
when a child care center was built in the middle of a lot and you wanted to build one down the street from it, you had to be 400 feet away to their property line. Those are all through the old ordinance. And even the current UDO and the current TOD, when it was adopted in 2020, and the TOD before that was done to a property line. I just think this is not only is it a strange way to do it, I think it is, it's not really fair to what all the neighborhoods were told the transition was going to be. And it seems to be going back on all of that. So I'm very concerned. And I think the neighborhood should push back on this very strongly.
we'll circle back with zoning administration and see what they were reading that was causing them to give that guidance. Unfortunately,
Okay.
none of them are on the call tonight.
I understand. No, and I don't want to debate it, but I'm very concerned about that one item. I think that's all the questions I have. I wrote some more, but others want to talk, I'm sure.
Kevin, we have a question on ADU changes. Kevin, could
Yeah.
you amplify on that?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I had seen that and I was reaching for the mute button and then I couldn't find it. But I did subsequently. Yeah, Melanie, you're asking a question about the changes to the ADU, and I may have not explained it in the most clear fashion, but let me try again. So based on your lot, based on your lot size, based on your principal structure size, you're allowed X amount of square footage of accessory structures. Be they garages, sheds, whatever the case may be. Currently, the way the UDO is constructed, that if you choose to have an ADU on your property, that ADU square footage gets baked into that total of the allowable square footage you can have for accessory structures. And what we have heard and found is that while it's great that people may be availing themselves of the ability to develop an ADU, it somewhat can constrain them to also allow them to have other accessory structures, like if they wanted a separate garage or if they wanted a shed, for example. And so what we are seeking to do, and I believe this is how the previous zoning ordinance read, was that area, that square footage of your accessory dwelling unit will now not be baked in or count against that allowable square footage for accessory structures on a lot, thereby allowing both people to take advantage and develop ADUs, but allow them the opportunity to have those additional accessory structures should they choose to have them on their lot, like that additional garage or that additional shed or whatever additional accessory structure they wish to have.
Yeah, that is great. But what I have seen, I'm a broker in charge of a real estate firm and here in Charlotte. And what I have seen in regards to the ADUs, of course, people are needing to start thinking outside of the box in terms of affordable housing, and just placement. What I've seen, I think the previous UDO said that it couldn't be more than 35% of the primary residence. And let's say, for instance, lots in we'll say off of Statesville Avenue and Statesville Road, over in the old Double Oaks community. There's a lot of habitat houses that are built there, even though they're coming through and they're redeveloping that area. There are some 1,000 square foot former habitat houses that are on big lots. And on the back of the lot, it could be a ADU placed on there for one aging senior family member or additional income for the homeowner. Well, with the previous 35%, you couldn't do anything over 350 square feet. And then on top of that, how it read is the name, the owner of the ADU, it had to be under the same ownership as the primary resident. And so that can, depending on finances or what have you, the average homeowner who still is carrying a mortgage and maybe their debt to income ratio would not be able to allow them to refinance and build something in the back. It was just some things that I think the average residents of Mecklenburg County would probably need that looked at just a little bit more. I get, taking that percentage off in order to build additional garages or workshops. But I think the biggest thing would be for the average homeowner to have the flexibility to put a little bit more square footage in the back.
Yeah, and if I could jump in on this one, Kevin, we
Sure.
are looking at a series of things that we can do to promote residential development, making some adjustments and uses and so forth, and understanding that affordability and so forth is an issue. We are going to be re-examining ADUs as part of that. It's something that would be coming in
Do you know why is it?
probably in the fall of this year. And
Okay.
so would invite you to send any thoughts you have to the website or
Absolutely.
the email address so that we can be getting input on that as we're thinking through this. So really
Okay,
appreciate
won't let me
you bringing
leave.
that up.
Absolutely. Thank you. We working with the city of Concord as well when they just developed their tiny home ordinance. So I would love to jump in and be of assistance any way that I can.
Oh, that's great. Yes, please do. Let us know thoughts.
Thank you.
And we did have another comment on ADUs, and similarly, we will be looking at the height of the ADUs, how these things can work best in our community and maintaining character, neighborhood character at the same time, trying to find all of that balance. We do have a question about the cost of these changes and how it will impact housing affordability. A lot of these
Do you
are,
know how to make this work? I mean, just
hey, can
I want to go back.
Alan, can you mute?
I've muted.
Thank you. And not you, mute yourself, Alan. I meant the person who was coming through. The other thing, the cost of these are really mostly technical changes. I don't know that we believe that there's really anything in here that is going to increase cost for housing affordability. And the better that we can make our process, I think, the less costs in people moving through the process and building homes. But we do have other text amendments with respect to residential coming through. We'll be filing a compact development text amendment probably later this week. So check our website for that. And then a housing supply text amendment late summer. So you'll want to follow those as well to help we understand how much affordability is a challenge right now and how we need to think as creatively as possible about how we can get housing out there in the right places with the right design. Right now, not seeing any additional questions. If anyone wants to raise their hand that still has questions, or we'll give folks a few more minutes. And then if we don't get more questions, no one raises their hand, we'll go ahead and adjourn. But let's see. I think, Michael, you are talking about the conservation text amendment. That's a separate text amendment from this one. So that is moving forward. It has already gone to hearing with council, and we'll be coming back to them on May 20th, the date that this general text amendment moves forward. We'll come back to them on the May 20th for decision. So, and in addition, we really think that conservation text amendment is intended for sites that have significant environmental constraints. So as an alternative to that, we have our base standards, and we also will be filing the compact text amendment that we think may be more appropriate for people to use. Anyone typing right now that we can't see, raise your hand, or if you want to raise your hand and come off of mute, we'd be glad to try to answer any additional questions that are out there. Well, seeing that everyone is pretty quiet, I think we will oh, it's happened to me earlier too. Any additional changes forthcoming? This is from Andy Zotwell, related to the Charlotte streets map and frontages. Nothing on the UDO side. I know that Charlotte Department of Transportation is really monitoring the streets map. They may have some things, though I have not heard of any definitive schedule for anything that may change on the streets map. But other than what we've discussed tonight, as far as how you navigate between NCDOT and the city of Charlotte related to the streets map, but utilities and so forth, we don't have anything coming on the UDO side. So thank you guys very much. We know your time is valuable, and feel free if you've got any other questions, something comes up after we adjourn, if you want to email to the UDO email address, we'd be glad to get back with you, and we appreciate your time. Thank you guys.